The year is 1242. You open your eyes to the gray light of dawn filtering through the thatched roof of a one-room cottage in a village nestled deep within the damp woods of rural France. The air is thick with the smell of wet straw, wood smoke, and the stale scent of boiled turnips. As you pull a thin, wool blanket tighter against the morning chill, the first thought that enters your mind isn't about the harvest or the hunger in your belly. It is about the watcher that I in the 13th century. Privacy is a concept that simply does not exist. Not because the walls are thin, though they are, but because the ceiling of your world is transparent to the divine. Every breath you take is governed by the silent, unblinking watch of the heavens. You have been taught since you could crawl that God knows the rhythm of your heart better than you do, and that every stray thought is a mark on a ledger that determines your eternity. As you step out into the muddy fields, the earth clings to your boots like the weight of original sin. Your body, you are told, is not truly yours. It is a temporary vessel, a fragile clay jar carrying a precious spark of light, your soul. But the vessel is porous. It is prone to leaking, to cracking, and to being stained by the world. To the medieval mind, the body is a battlefield. On one side stands the spirit, striving for the crystalline purity of the stars, on the other stands the flesh, heavy and dark, pulled toward the mud by the gravity of temptation. You feel this battle in the smallest moments. When you look at the baker's daughter and feel a sudden, sharp warmth in your chest, you don't call it attraction. You call it a whisper. You call it the wolf at the door. The church has spent centuries building a vocabulary for your instincts, and every word is a warning. The sermons you hear every Sunday in the stone-cold parish church are designed to boil your anatomy down to a single, terrifying fact: your body will betray you. Lust isn't just a feeling, it's a cardinal sin, a snare set by the devil who, as the priest says with a grim fervor, loves to hide in warm places. From the pulpit, the message is as sharp as a reaper's scythe. The flesh is weak. This is the mantra of your life. You are told that the soul should ride the body like a nobleman rides a horse. But what happens when the horse bolts? What happens when the horse grows frisky and ignores the reins? In the 13th century, a bolting horse doesn't just lead to a fall, it leads to the abyss. This spiritual surveillance creates a unique kind of psychological pressure. Imagine walking through your day knowing that even an itch or a glance is being weighed. If you look too long at a forbidden fruit, be it a neighbor's prosperity or a stranger's beauty, you are committing a sin of the eye. If you listen to a bawdy song at the harvest festival, you are committing a sin of the ear. The world is a minefield of sensory triggers designed to trip the soul on its journey toward salvation, but humans are, and always have been, stubborn creatures. Despite the Latin scoldings and the terrifying frescoes of demons pitchforking sinners into lakes of fire, the horse remains frisky. The tension between human instinct and spiritual ideals plays out in the quiet corners of your village. It's in the secret glances exchanged behind the granary, the whispered jokes told over a communal bowl of pottage, and the desperate prayers muttered into pillows at night. Life in this era is a delicate dance between human instinct and spiritual survival. You are caught in a perpetual loop of desire and debt. You feel a natural human urge, you immediately feel the crushing weight of guilt, you seek penance, you feel a temporary relief, and then, because you are human, the cycle begins again. This isn't just about sexuality, it's about the very nature of existence. To be alive is to be in danger. The church doesn't just discourage pleasure, it actively fears it because pleasure short-circuits reason. When you are happy, when you are lost in the thrill of a dance or the warmth of a meal, you are not thinking of the ledger. And to the medieval authorities, a mind not thinking of the ledger is a mind open to the enemy. I in the drafty cottages of England, where the winter wind howls through the cracks in the wattle-and daub walls, this spiritual weight is perhaps the only thing heavier than the physical labor of survival. You spend your days tilling soil that isn't yours, for a Lord you rarely see, under a God who sees everything. The mud of the field and the mud of the soul become indistinguishable. However, it would be a mistake to think that the medieval person lived in a state of constant, paralyzed terror. They were experts at finding the blur. While the high-ranking theologians like Thomas Aquinas were busy debating the precise nature of original sin, the common folk were busy finding loopholes. They believed in ordered pleasure. If you loved your spouse, perhaps the sin of desire was dampened. If you gave a portion of your meager crop to the poor, perhaps the ledger was balanced. They lived in a world of spiritual bartering. You would sin on a Tuesday, confess on a Saturday, and hope that the divine gaze was momentarily diverted by the smoke of the incense during Sunday. Massachusetts, yet the weight of sin remained a physical sensation. It was as real as the ache in your back after a day of harvest. When a plague hit or a crop failed, the village didn't look for weather patterns or bacteria, they looked inward. What have we done, they would ask. Whose secret longing brought the wrath of the heavens upon us? This collective guilt meant that your private battle with temptation was also a public responsibility. If you let the wolf at the door in, you weren't just risking your own soul, you were risking the safety of the entire parish. As the sun sets over the 13th century horizon, the bells of the monastery ring for vespers. The sound travels across the fields, a reminder that the conversation between earth and heaven never stops. You return to your cottage, your body exhausted, your mind a swirl of the day's small triumphs and hidden shames. You lie down on the straw, the same straw you woke up on. The darkness of the room is absolute, yet you feel as though you are standing under a spotlight. The silent watch follows you into your dreams. You pray for a clean conscience, but even your dreams are not safe. The church warns that the devil can visit you in sleep, taking the form of your deepest desires to trick the soul while the rider is unconscious. This was the reality of the 13th century. It was a world of breathtaking beauty and bone-deep fear. It was a time when a simple glance was a spiritual event and a secret longing was a cosmic rebellion. You lived your life on a tightrope, balanced between the animal drives of the flesh and the angelic aspirations of the spirit, always aware that the ground beneath you was not just earth, it was the entrance to an eternity you spent every waking second trying to earn. In the end, the medieval person wasn't just a survivor of famine and war, they were a survivor of their own consciousness. They carried the weight of the heavens on their shoulders, walking through the mud of Europe with their eyes turned upward, forever dancing the delicate, dangerous dance of the human soul. If the pulpit was the heart of medieval law, then the tavern and the market square were the lungs of medieval reality. While the 13th century church attempted to cast a monolithic shadow over every human interaction, the light of human nature had a way of bleeding through the cracks. This was an era defined by a staggering paradox, a society that officially loathed the flesh but was practically obsessed with it. The tavern and the marketplace step away from the cold, vaulted echoes of the cathedral and walk into the local tavern on a Friday night. Here, the silent watch of the heavens felt a little further away, muffled by the smell of fermented ale and the heat of too many bodies pressed together in a small space. In this dim, amber-lit sanctuary, the strict decrees of the church were often treated like old weather reports, acknowledged, but largely ignored once the drink began to flow. In the tavern, the wolf at the door wasn't a demon to be feared, it was a guest at the table. Here, the language of the people was earthy, ribald, and unapologetically physical. The same peasants who crossed themselves in terror during a sermon on Sunday would spend their Friday nights singing fabliaux, short, raunchy stories about unfaithful wives, bumbling priests, and the hilarious mishaps of lust. These stories served as a pressure valve, a way for the common man to laugh at the very rules that squeezed his soul. It was a world where the sacred and the profane lived in a constant, sweaty embrace. The paradox didn't stop at the tavern door, it followed the holy men and women right into the stone silence of the monasteries. To the medieval mind, taking a vow of celibacy was the ultimate act of spiritual warfare. It was an attempt to become like the angels, beings of pure light with no biological needs. But angels do not have blood, and they do not have memories. Within the cloisters, the struggle was not a metaphor, it was a daily, grueling reality. We find evidence of this in the margins of their prayer books, where bored or frustrated monks doodled marginalia, bizarre, often erotic drawings of half-human creatures and suggestive symbols. These weren't necessarily acts of rebellion, they were the involuntary twitches of a repressed psyche. History tells us of housekeepers, who lived in rectories, of nephews, who bore a striking resemblance to the local priest, and of secret correspondences between nuns and monks that read more like romance novels than theological treatises. These men and women were caught in the sharpest part of the paradox, they were the official guardians of a morality that their own bodies frequently revolted against. They sought to reconcile the divine gaze with the warmth of a human hand, proving that even walls of consecrated stone could not keep out the persistent whispers of the heart. The business of heirs for the nobility, the paradox took a more transactional form. In the high castles of the Loire Valley or the fortified manors of England, sex was rarely discussed as pleasure, it was discussed as lineage. For a nobleman, his wife's womb was a political asset, a furnace meant to forge the next link in the chain of power. The church provided a narrow, joyless script for these unions, sex was a marital debt owed for the purpose of procreation. Anything beyond the functional was viewed with suspicion, often labeled as unnatural or excessive. Yet, this clinical view of human connection created a vacuum that the human spirit rushed to fill with something far more dangerous: courtly love, the invention of romance. While the theologians were defining sex as a necessary evil, the poets, the troubadours, were inventing romance as we know it today. This was the fin amour, or pure love. It was a cultural phenomenon that turned the church's hierarchy on its head. In courtly love, the lover did not worship God, he worshipped his lady. A knight would undergo trials, compose songs, and pine away in a state of noble suffering for a woman who was often unattainable, usually married to his lord. This was a direct defiance of every social and religious rule. It celebrated desire for desire's sake. It suggested that the beating heart had its own laws, separate from the laws of the king or the pope. This created a strange, dual-track existence for the medieval elite. By day, they attended mass and spoke of duty and chastity. By night, they read stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, weeping over a love that was, by all official accounts, a one-way ticket to hell. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was a survival strategy for the soul. They lived in a tension between the world they were told they should want and the world they actually felt. The church, ever pragmatic, eventually realized it could not win a war against biology. This led to the final, most cynical part of the paradox, the commodification of sin. If the flesh was going to fail, the church would be there to collect the tax on that failure. Confession manuals from the 13th century became increasingly graphic and detailed, categorizing every possible human interaction with the precision of a tax auditor. Did you do this? Did you think that? How many times? Each sin had a price, a certain number of prayers, a pilgrimage, or a donation to the building of a new chapel. This turned the struggle between faith and flesh into a ledger of debits and credits. It allowed the medieval person to navigate the paradox. You could succumb to the fires of passion on a warm summer night, and by the next afternoon, through the ritual of penance, you could be reset to a state of grace. It was a cycle that acknowledged the inevitability of human failure while maintaining the absolute authority of the divine. As the sun sets over a medieval village, you see the paradox in motion. The priest finishes his evening prayers, perhaps thinking of the woman who bakes his bread. The Lord looks at his wife, seeing both a political partner and a source of forbidden longing. The peasant in the tavern laughs a little too loudly at a joke that would make a bishop faint. They all lived under the same silent watch, but they had learned to find the shadows where that watch couldn't reach. They proved that while you can build cathedrals to reach the heavens and write laws to bind the earth, you cannot build a cage strong enough for the human heart. The paradox of faith and flesh wasn't a flaw in the medieval world, it was its defining characteristic. It was the friction between what they were supposed to be and who they actually were that generated the heat of their culture, their art, their poetry, and their enduring humanity. They walked a tightrope over a lake of fire, but they did it with a song in their hearts and a secret in their pockets, forever proving that the soul's greatest rebellion is simply the act of feeling. In the 13th century, to look at a human body was to look at a map of the cosmos. There was no such thing as a biological accident. If your heart raced, if your skin erupted in sores, or if a woman could not conceive, the cause was never merely physical. It was a sign that the delicate gears of the universe, the stars, the elements, and the spirits, had shifted out of alignment. This was a world where science was not the enemy of magic, but its twin sister, strange brew, where the physician's blade was guided by the position of the moon. To understand the medieval body, one had to understand the humors. The doctors of the age, drawing on ancient Greek texts filtered through centuries of monastic copying, believed the body was a vessel for four primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was not the absence of germs, which were unknown, but a state of eucrasia, or perfect balance. That if you were too hot-blooded, you were sanguine and prone to lust; if you were too cold and dry, you were melancholic and prone to visions. A simple fever wasn't just an infection, it was an excess of heat that needed to be bled out with leeches or cooled with specific herbs gathered under a waning moon. The doctor was less a scientist and more a gardener of the human soul, pruning and watering the body to keep the internal weather from turning into a storm. this created a life of constant self-monitoring. People watched their own sweat, their urine, and their breath with a level of scrutiny that would seem obsessive today. They believed that what you ate, the air you breathed, and even the music you listened to could alter your internal chemistry, making you more or less vulnerable to the shadows of the world. The wandering womb and the female mystery. Nowhere was the misunderstood anatomy more apparent than in the treatment of women. The medieval medical mind viewed the female body as a chaotic, leaky version of the male standard. The most famous of these theories was the wandering womb. Physicians believed the uterus was a living, sentient creature with its own unpredictable temperament. If a woman became hysterical or depressed, it was thought that her womb had literally detached itself and was traveling upward through her body, pressing against her heart or lungs in search of moisture. To cure this, doctors used scent therapy, placing foul-smelling substances near the woman's nose to drive the womb downward, while placing sweet-smelling herbs near her lower body to lure it back into place. This wasn't just medical malpractice, it was a physical manifestation of the era's view of women as inherently unstable. Their bodies were seen as cold and moist, needing the heat of a man to remain functional. Yet, in a classic medieval contradiction, this weakness also made women supposedly more susceptible to the supernatural, turning their bodies into the primary target for both divine visions and demonic influence. When it came to the mystery of life, conception, the line between medicine and folklore vanished entirely. If a couple could not produce an heir, the burden of proof almost always fell upon the woman. To test if her reproductive tunnels were open, a popular medical test involved the use of garlic. A clove of garlic would be inserted into the vagina overnight. If the woman woke up the next morning with the scent of garlic on her breath, it was considered a success. It meant her internal passages were clear from end to end. If not, she was blocked, often considered a sign of a spiritual knot that required prayer or expensive charms to untie. Men, however, were not entirely exempt from the oddity of the age. To increase potency, they might be told to consume powdered dog testicles or wine infused with specific, hot spices. There was a deep-seated belief that semen was distilled blood, a precious substance that held the very spark of the soul. To waste it was to waste one's life force, leading to a medical obsession with nocturnal emissions, which were seen not as a biological function, but as a theft by spirits. In the 13th century, sleep was not a time of rest, it was a journey into a dangerous borderland. Dreams were feared as visits from the outside. If you had an erotic dream, you hadn't just had a subconscious thought, you had been visited by a succubus or an incubus, nocturnal demons that took human form to harvest the essence of the living. Sleep paralysis was interpreted as a demon sitting on one's chest, and a restless night was a sign of a soul in turmoil. This meant that bedtime rituals were as complex as a surgical procedure. People slept with holy relics under their pillows, drew protective circles in the air, and muttered specific psalms to guard the gates of the senses while they were unconscious. The bedroom was the front line of a spiritual war, and the restless night was a battle lost. To the medieval person, every ailment had a spiritual price. A skin rash might be the physical manifestation of a bitter heart. A sudden cramp might be the result of a malicious glance from a neighbor, the dreaded evil eye. Because they didn't understand germs, they filled the void of knowledge with meaning. This made the experience of being sick incredibly lonely and terrifying. You weren't just fighting a virus, you were wondering which of your sins had manifested as a cough. You were wondering if your humors had been corrupted by a demon or if the stars had simply aligned against you. The physician and the exorcist were often the same person, or at least worked in the same building. Treatment involved a strange brew of the practical and the mystical. A doctor might prescribe willow bark for pain, which we now know contains the precursor to aspirin, but he would insist you take it while reciting the Pater Noster 10 times while facing east. The medicine worked, they believed, because the prayer gave the plant the permission to heal. Life in this era was lived in the shadow of the unseen. Your body was a battleground where medicine met magic every single day. A simple fever could be the start of a transformation, purgatory on earth. People didn't just get better, they were restored by the grace of the elements and the mercy of the divine. This medical mysticism created a profound connection between the individual and the universe. You weren't a random collection of cells, you were a microcosmos. The iron in your blood was linked to Mars, the fluids in your brain were linked to the moon. While this led to terrifying treatments like bloodletting and garlic tests, it also gave the medieval person a sense of immense significance. Every ache was a cosmic event. As the village healer walked through the muddy streets, carrying a satchel filled with dried frogs, crushed emeralds, and lavender, she was the guardian of this mystery. She was the one who translated the language of the body into the language of the stars. In the 13th century, to be healthy was to be in harmony with the invisible world, and to be sick was to be a soul out of tune with the music of the spheres. No law, no prayer, and no doctor could fully demystify the body's mysteries. They lived in a world where the skin was a thin veil between the world we see and the world we fear, proving that in the heart of the Middle Ages, the greatest mystery of all was simply being alive. As we look through the flickering candlelight of history, peering past the heavy stone cathedrals and the mud-caked fields of the 13th century, it is easy to see only the darkness. We see the silent watch of a judgmental heaven, the terrifying, wandering wombs of medical lore, and the iron grip of the Inquisition. But if we look closer, into the margins of the manuscripts, the lyrics of the folk songs, and the graffiti carved into village walls, we find a startling truth: the medieval people were not so different from us. They were not merely victims of their time, they were the architects of a secret, vibrant joy that thrived in the shadows of a rigid society. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, laughter was not a luxury, it was a survival mechanism. The same society that produced grim treatises on the agony of hell also created the Feast of Fools. Once a year, the social order was turned upside down. Clergy would wear their robes inside out, songs were sung out of tune, and a Lord of Misrule was crowned to mock the very authorities that governed daily life. This was the resilience of the human spirit in its loudest form. It was a declaration that no matter how many sermons were preached about the weakness of the flesh, the human capacity for play could not be extinguished. They laughed at the plague, they laughed at the tax collector, and they laughed at the devil himself. This humor was the glimmer of freedom that kept the heart from turning to stone under the weight of public penance. The medieval life was indeed a rich tapestry, but it was one woven with threads of both coarse wool and fine silk. To live in the 1200s was to exist in a state of constant physical struggle. You felt the bite of the winter wind through your tunic, you knew the hollow ache of a failed harvest. But within that struggle, there was an intensity of passion that our modern, climate-controlled world often lacks. When they loved with a desperation born of the knowledge that tomorrow was never guaranteed. We see this in the thousands of songs left behind by the troubadours and the common folk alike. These weren't just polite verses, they were raw, bleeding expressions of desire. They wrote of amour de l'âne, love from afar, and of the sweet torture of a single glance. Despite the prying eyes of the neighbors and the looming threat of the sin of the flesh, they continued to seek connection. They met in the dim corners of bathhouses, whispered in the tall grass of the summer meadows, and exchanged tokens of affection, small pewter brooches or dried flowers, that served as silent rebellions against a world that demanded only duty. The 13th century saw the rise of the Inquisition, a machinery of surveillance designed to root out heresy and deviance. It was a time when a single careless word about the nature of the soul could lead to a dark cell or a public shaming. Yet, the human spirit proved to be remarkably slippery. History is full of records of ordinary rebels. There were the Cathars who lived simple lives of poverty in defiance of the church's wealth, and the Beguines, women who lived in communal houses, serving the poor and studying scripture without taking formal vows or submitting to a male confessor. These people didn't necessarily want to destroy the church, they simply wanted to find a personal path to the divine that felt honest. They chose warmth over doctrine, proving that the individual conscience is a fortress that no inquisition can fully breach. That we often imagine the medieval person as a stoic, alien figure, but their records of grief tell a more familiar story. When we read the laments written by mothers who lost children to the sweating sickness, or the poems written by men whose friends fell in distant crusades, the distance of 800 years vanishes. Their tears were as salt as ours, their heartbreak was just as shattering, but just as they grieved deeply, they found joy in the smallest flickers. A wedding in the village wasn't just a ceremony, it was a 3-day explosion of dance, music, and communal eating that defied the scarcity of the times. The arrival of a traveling minstrel was a window into a world of fantasy and wonder. They found beauty in the intricate carvings of a wooden spoon and the vibrant colors of a stained glass window. These small aesthetic triumphs were their way of saying, "I am here, and I am more than my labor." Love, in all its forbidden forms, remained the ultimate act of resilience. While the law recognized only the marital debt for heirs, the people recognized the beating heart. We find evidence of queer lives lived in the shadows, monks who shared special friendships that exceeded the bounds of brotherly love, and women who found ways to live together in lifelong partnerships disguised as religious devotion. They used the language of the church itself to shield their passions. They called their love spiritual when it was physical, and divine when it was deeply human. This wasn't just trickery, it was a sophisticated navigation of a dangerous landscape. They sought connection because, in a world that could be cold and indifferent, another person's heartbeat was the only true sanctuary. As we reach the end of this journey through the medieval mind, we see that the darkness of the Middle Ages was never absolute. It was a world of high contrast, deep shadows and brilliant lights. The resilience of the human spirit is the thread that pulls us through the mud of France and the drafty cottages of England. The medieval person reminds us that freedom isn't always a grand political revolution. Sometimes, freedom is a song sung in secret. Sometimes, it is a recipe shared between neighbors, or a dream of a better world whispered into the darkness of a straw bed. They taught us that even when the silent watch is most oppressive, the soul can still find a way to dance. When we extinguish the flickering candlelight of history, and return to our world of silicon and steel, we carry their legacy with us. The medieval world was the laboratory where the modern heart was forged. Their struggles with faith, their misunderstandings of the body, and their desperate pursuit of love are the foundations upon which our own lives are built. They remind us that no society is ever so rigid that it can crush the resilience of love. They remind us that even in the darkest of ages, humanity is a fire that cannot be put out. Their lives, rich, messy, passionate, and brave, are a testament to the fact that we are never truly alone in our struggle for meaning. In the end, the story of the 13th century is not a story of a dead past. It is a living mirror. When we look at them, we see ourselves, humans trying to find warmth in the cold, trying to find truth in the mystery, and forever seeking that glimmer of freedom that makes the long journey of the soul worth every difficult step. Their spirit, resilient and alive, still whispers to us through the centuries, "Do not be afraid of the shadows. The heart knows the way home."